The sun crested the jagged peaks, painting the valley in long, sharp shadows. Mist coiled around the mountain base like a living shroud, thick and cold. Then, the sky fractured. A slow, deliberate tear appeared in the firmament, widening until the blue gave way to a blinding, impossible light. From the rift, colossal forms descended, drifting toward the earth with a sound like grinding glass. The air vibrated, rattling the teeth of every living thing below. Humans huddled in the tall grass, pressing their chests into the dirt. They shielded their eyes, fingers digging into the soil, as the radiance washed over the landscape. The beings moved with a heavy, rhythmic grace, their wings spanning the horizon and blotting out the morning sun. The sky continued to bleed light, and the shadow of the visitors fell across the valley, turning the morning into a pale, artificial twilight. The giants touched the earth. Their feet did not merely land, they sank into the soil, displacing the dirt and leaving behind glowing, molten imprints that pulsed with rhythmic light. The grass around their feet withered instantly, turning to ash under the sheer intensity of their presence. The Watchers stood as luminous pillars, their forms shimmering like liquid starlight, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched across the valley floor. The humans remained pressed into the earth, their breath hitching as the giants loomed over them. One figure, taller and more defined than the rest, stepped forward. He moved with a deliberate, heavy gait that shook the ground with every stride. He stopped just feet from the huddled group. His radiance dimmed, revealing eyes that scanned the mortals with a cold, analytical precision. He looked at his companions, his jaw tightening until the muscles stood out against his skin. He did not speak, but the air between them grew thick. He raised a single hand, palm open toward the valley, and the wind ceased entirely. The silence became absolute. The pact was already forming. The Watchers turned from the valley, their forms drifting upward like smoke caught in a draft. They converged on a desolate peak, a jagged tooth of rock rising far above the clouds. The air here was thin, biting, and tasted of ozone, casting strobe-like flashes that illuminated the solemn circle they formed on the summit. They stood in a ring, their radiance dimming to a dull, pulsing hum. The leader stepped into the center, his movements precise and cold. He reached out, fingers splayed, and his companions mirrored the gesture. As their hands touched, the air between them ignited. Veins of white, jagged light pulsed from palm to palm, weaving a web of energy that locked them into a singular, unified purpose. The static grew violent, snapping against the rock face and raising the hair on the skin. The pact was sealed. The hum of the static deepened into a low, resonant drone that vibrated through the mountain itself. The morning light hit the valley floor, turning the dew into a fine silver mist. In a clearing shielded by ancient trees, the Watcher descended. He did not hover. He stepped onto the earth, his presence causing the tall grass to flatten in a perfect, radiating circle. He knelt, his movements fluid and heavy, sinking into the dry, sun-baked soil. The human man stood 3 paces away, his chest rising and falling. He watched as the Watcher extended a long, slender finger. The Watcher pressed the tip into the sand, dragging it with deliberate force. A line appeared, sharp and deep, followed by a curve that defied the natural geometry of the earth. He traced a complex, interlocking shape. The Watcher pulled his hand back, leaving the symbol glowing faintly. He looked up, his expression unreadable, and gestured for the man to approach. The human man stepped forward, his boots crunching against the silence. He knelt beside the mark, his fingers hovering inches above the sand. He reached out, his hand trembling, and pressed his own skin into the groove. The man traced the shape, his eyes widening as the logic locked into his mind. The human woman took up the heavy iron rod, her grip tightening until her knuckles turned white. She laid the metal against the anvil, the surface pitted and cold. With a rhythmic, metallic ring, she brought the hammer down. Each strike flattened the raw iron, drawing it out into a jagged, lethal edge. The Watcher stood nearby, his gaze fixed on the transformation, his presence radiating a heat that made the air shimmer. Beside the anvil, the human man worked the bellows, his movements frantic and precise. A stray spark flew from the iron, landing in the dry grass at their feet. Instead of a normal flame, it erupted in a searing, unnatural blue. The fire did not spread outward, it surged upward, licking at the base of the anvil. The woman did not stop. She hammered faster, the rhythmic clangor echoing against the trees. The blue fire intensified, casting long, distorted shadows. She pulled a finished blade from the heat, its surface glowing with a faint, sickly light, and tossed it onto the growing pile. The heap of weapons shivered. The woman reached for another rod, her brow slick with sweat, her eyes locked on the pile. The work was relentless, a desperate race against the encroaching blue flames. The final hammer blow rang out, but the sound did not fade. It deepened, vibrating through the soles of the humans' feet. The ground beneath the clearing groaned, a low, tectonic protest that sent cracks spiderwebbing through the dry earth. The blue fire vanished, sucked into the fissures as if the soil itself were hungry. From the widest rift, a hand emerged, massive, pale and pulsing. A titan rose, 10 feet of height, its form a jarring blend of celestial grace and mortal density. It stood, casting a shadow that smothered the remaining light. The Nephilim took its first step, and the ground buckled. It did not walk. It forced the world to yield. It strode toward the village, its heavy footfalls landing with the force of falling stone. Each impact sent a shockwave through the soil. The village foundations, built on generations of stability, began to fracture. Stone walls groaned, mortar turning to dust as the Titan passed by. The Titan reached the village perimeter, its shadow stretching long and jagged across the first row of homes, and the structures began to collapse. The mother pressed her back against the crumbling masonry, the rough stone biting into her skin. She pulled her child tight against her chest, burying the small face into her shoulder to muffle any sound. Her breath came in shallow, jagged hitches. Outside the wall, the ground rhythmically buckled. The Titan strode past, its shadow sweeping over the ruins like a shroud of ink. She peered through a jagged crack in the stone, her eyes wide. The giant stopped. A wooden cart sat in its path, laden with grain. The Titan raised a massive arm, its movements slow and devoid of effort. With a single sweeping swing, it crushed the cart into splinters. Grain spilled across the dirt. The mother squeezed her eyes shut, her knuckles white. The silence that followed was a suffocating, hollow dread. The horizon began to warp. It started with the tides, which retreated far beyond the low water mark, exposing miles of rotting kelp and jagged reef. Then, the ocean returned with a roar, breaching the natural boundaries of the shore and flooding the lowlands in a single, relentless surge. Salt water poured into the village streets, swirling around the debris of the Titan's path. Above, the atmosphere thickened. The familiar blue of the sky bled away, replaced by a deep, sickly hue the color of a fresh bruise, purple and mottled with veins of charcoal gray. The air grew heavy, static-charged and difficult to draw into the lungs. Birds fell silent, dropping from the branches as if the gravity itself had shifted. The wind, which had been howling through the ruins, abruptly ceased. A profound, unnatural stillness settled over the landscape, a silence so absolute it rang in the ears. Every living thing seemed to hold its breath. High above the mountain peaks, the bruised clouds began to fray. They did not drift. They were torn apart by an unseen force. A jagged rift opened in the firmament, widening until the light of the heavens spilled through, blinding and cold. The clouds parted completely, revealing the silhouettes of a vast, descending host. The light from the rift did not merely shine, it burned. It poured down in concentrated beams, scouring the valley floor and turning the rising floodwaters into steam. From the center of this radiance, a single figure emerged. He drifted downward, his presence so immense that the mountain peaks seemed to shrink in his shadow. He landed on the highest summit, the rock cracking beneath his weight. He stood motionless, his gaze sweeping across the ruined landscape, lingering on the wreckage of the village and the lingering traces of the Nephilim. The air around him shimmered with heat, distorting the view of the horizon. He moved with a cold, terrifying precision, stepping forward to the very edge of the precipice. He reached for the hilt of the blade at his side. The metal glowed with an intense, internal heat, casting long, flickering reflections against the dark clouds. He drew the sword in one fluid, sweeping motion. The blade hummed, a sound that vibrated through the marrow of the earth. He held it high, pointing the tip toward the heavens. A fraction of a second later, he brought the weapon down. The resulting thunderclap shattered the remaining silence. It tore through the valley, leveling the last standing structures and shaking the very foundations of the mountains. The war had begun. The sky erupted. Thousands of streaks, white and searing like molten metal, tore through the bruised clouds. They did not fall. They plummeted with the weight of stars, carving glowing furrows into the atmosphere. The sound was not of wind, but of tearing fabric, a high-pitched scream that preceded the impact. As the first wave struck the valley, the ground buckled. Shock waves radiated outward from every landing point, flattening the remaining stone walls and turning the dust of the village into a blinding fog. In the center of the chaos, the Watchers stood firm. They did not retreat. They planted their feet in the shifting soil. Each time a shockwave hit them, their radiance dimmed, flickering like a candle in a gale. The confrontation was absolute, a collision of two opposing forces that turned the valley into a crucible. The air between the two hosts turned into a web of white-hot static. Without a word, the angels raised their hands, and the atmosphere solidified into jagged, glowing links. These chains of pure, searing light materialized in an instant, whipping through the air with the sound of cracking bone. They coiled around the Watchers like vipers, biting into their forms and locking with a metallic, resonant thud. One Watcher lunged forward, his hands grasping at the links, his palms blistering as he tried to tear the light apart. The chains only tightened, pulsing with a rhythmic, blinding intensity that forced him back to his knees. The struggle was violent and desperate. Every time a Watcher moved, the chains flared, dragging them back into a rigid, kneeling position. The ground beneath them cracked under the sudden weight. They thrashed, their forms flickering and distorting, but the light held firm. It was a systematic dismantling of their defiance. One by one, the Watchers were pulled into a tight, suffocating circle, their limbs pinned to their sides by the glowing bonds. The rebels were subdued. The valley floor began to scream. It was not a sound of wind, but the deep, tectonic grinding of stone against stone as the earth itself recoiled from the divine host. The angels did not wait. With a synchronized movement, they turned toward the center of the valley, their wings casting long, jagged shadows across the ruins. They planted their feet, the ground bowing under their collective weight, and began to pull. The soil beneath the bound Watchers fractured. A hairline crack appeared, glowing with a sickly, light-absorbing violet, before it tore open with a deafening roar. A chasm emerged, wide and jagged, plunging into an abyss of absolute, suffocating black. It was a wound in the world, a void that swallowed the remaining light. The angels heaved. The chains of light went taut, vibrating with a high-frequency hum that made the very air feel brittle. The Watchers were dragged backward, their feet carving deep, glowing furrows into the dirt as they fought for purchase. They reached out, fingers clawing at the debris, but the force of the divine host was relentless. They were pulled toward the edge of the dark, their forms silhouetted against the encroaching nothingness. At the edge of the abyss, the Watchers paused. Their radiance pulsed, a frantic, dying rhythm against the encroaching dark. The angels stood motionless, their hands locked onto the chains, before they opened their fingers in unison. The tension snapped. The Watchers did not scream. They simply vanished into the throat of the void. As they fell, their light stretched thin, warping like liquid metal before it was swallowed by the absolute black of the chasm. There was no sound of impact, only the sudden, violent cessation of the hum that had gripped the valley. The chains of light dissolved into sparks, drifting down like cooling embers into the darkness. Then, the ground beneath the angels shuddered and sealed shut, leaving only a scar of scorched earth. The sky, previously bruised and turbulent, began to settle. The wind died instantly. The pressure that had weighed on the valley for hours lifted, replaced by a vacuum of sound. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, thick, and suffocating. It pressed against the ruins, against the broken stone. The silence held for a heartbeat, then fractured. It began as a low, resonant vibration that rattled the loose stones of the ruined village. Enoch stood in the center of the debris, his boots crunching against the pulverized rock. He did not move. He watched as the horizon line began to ripple, the air distorting like heat haze over a desert floor. Then, the sky itself gave way. It did not tear, it peeled. Layers of reality pulled back, revealing a hidden architecture of crystal light that burned with a cold, geometric precision. The clouds dissolved, not into rain, but into drifting shards of luminescence that caught the remaining light of the day. The atmosphere grew thin, ionized, and sharp. Enoch gripped his own arms, feeling the static charge raise the hair on his skin. Above him, the firmament opened like a blooming flower, exposing a depth of space that defied the limits of the eye. He was the only thing left standing in the valley. The light from the hidden realm poured down, washing over the broken landscape and bleaching the color from the earth. He stood as a lone silhouette against the brilliance. The ground beneath Enoch did not shake. It simply ceased to hold him. His heels lifted, then his toes, until he was suspended in the thin, ionized air. The gravity of the earth lost its grip, replaced by an upward pull that tugged at his core. He did not fight the motion. He drifted, his body turning slowly as the valley floor receded into a dark, jagged smudge. Around him, the clouds that had once been gray and heavy transformed into swirling rivers of molten gold and white fire. They did not burn his skin. They felt like rushing water, cool and electric. He passed through layers of atmosphere that shimmered with the intensity of 1,000 suns. Every breath he drew tasted of ozone and ancient starlight. Below, the ruins of the village were swallowed by the distance, becoming nothing more than a speck. He reached out, his fingers brushing against currents of light that hummed with a low, harmonic vibration. The world of stone and soil was gone. He accelerated, his form becoming a streak of shadow against the brilliant, burning rivers of the firmament. The ascent was absolute. The rivers of fire vanished. The motion stopped. Enoch crossed a threshold where space ceased to be a distance and became a shape. He stepped onto a floor of translucent obsidian that stretched into an impossible horizon. Here, the silence was not an absence of sound. It was a physical weight, pressing against his chest like deep water. He struggled to draw a breath, the air thick with the static of unmanifested potential. Around him, the architecture defied gravity. Pillars of light intersected at impossible angles, forming arches that twisted into complex, shifting fractals. He walked forward, his footsteps silent, the sound swallowed by the oppressive density of the room. Every movement felt like wading through glass. He reached the center of the vast expanse, where the geometry converged into a singular point of intensity. Before him rose a throne, constructed of light so pure, it burned the eyes to look upon it. It was shrouded in a blinding, pulsating radiance that vibrated through the floor and up into his bones. He stopped. The scale of the structure dwarfed his human frame, rendering him a mere speck of dust in the presence of the infinite. He lowered his head and sank to his knees. The radiance above the throne shifted, thinning like a veil drawn back. From the blinding core, ancient scrolls began to unfurl, spilling into the air like ribbons of molten ink. They did not hang still. They writhed, twisting into geometric patterns that defied the laws of space. Enoch watched as the symbols ignited, burning with a cold blue fire that etched themselves into his vision. Each character was a blueprint of a moment, a sequence of cause and effect that spanned eons. He saw the scrolls expand, filling the void with the history of everything. A micro-turn of reality occurred before his eyes. A timeline snapped, and he was pulled into the perspective of the collapse. He saw a star, massive and ancient, buckle under its own gravity. It imploded, turning from gold to a bruised violet, then vanishing into a point of absolute darkness. The scrolls pulsed in rhythm with the dying light. He reached out, his hand trembling, but he did not touch the parchment. He was the witness now. The mechanics of the universe were laid bare, a complex machine of light and shadow, and he absorbed every detail. Enoch stood, his gaze locked onto the infinite. The scrolls dissolved into white static, their secrets etched into his memory. Enoch stood alone in the center of the throne room, a silhouette of purpose against the blinding horizon. He did not move, yet he felt the space around him begin to contract. The radiance from the throne surged, no longer a distant light, but a tide of pure energy. It reached out, wrapping around his limbs like liquid fire. He felt his skin grow thin, the boundaries of his body blurring into the surrounding brilliance. He tried to anchor his thoughts to the earth he had left behind, but the memory of soil and stone evaporated under the heat of the divine. The light pushed inward, dismantling the architecture of his form. His hands, his chest, his face, all began to lose their density, turning into translucent patterns of light. He was no longer a man standing in a room. He was a conduit. The brilliance of the throne room receded, pulling back into the hidden folds of the universe. The hum of destiny vanished, leaving behind a vacuum of sound. Below, the earth emerged from the shadow of the divine. The jagged peaks stood silent, their sharp edges softened by a thin gray mist. The wreckage of the village lay undisturbed, the shattered stone and splintered wood frozen in place. There was no wind. No movement stirred the tall grass. The sky, once bruised and fractured, cleared into a vast, empty expanse of pale blue. The unnatural blue fire had long since burned out, leaving only cold, blackened patches on the ground. A profound, heavy quiet settled over the valley, a stillness that felt both hollow and complete. The conflict had ended, the actors had departed, and the world remained as a monument to what had passed. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. The cycle of the humans and the Watchers had dissolved into the memory of the land, leaving the valley to rest in an eternal, undisturbed peace under the watchful, silent stars.